There is something peculiar about hatred. It rarely stays still. No emotion this powerful is willing to occupy only a small corner of our lives. When it isn't understood, it grows. When it isn't transformed, it spreads. And when it is fed day after day, it quietly begins to shape the way we see the world. Everything can start with something that seems insignificant. A driver cutting you off in traffic that lingers in your mind long after it's over. A sarcastic remark that keeps echoing for hours. An injustice you suffered years ago that belongs to the past, yet still stirs emotions as if it happened yesterday. Little by little, what began as a wound becomes a constant presence. The person who caused the pain may have moved on. The circumstances have changed. Time has passed. Yet a part of our energy remains trapped in that moment, returning to the same place again and again. Hatred has a unique characteristic. It does not limit itself to the person who hurt us. It also changes the person who carries it. Perhaps that is why so many spiritual traditions, across different cultures and different eras, have treated this emotion with such seriousness. Not because anger is forbidden. Not because pain is wrong. But because there is a profound difference between passing through an emotion and building a home inside it. When resentment lingers for too long, it stops being a reaction to an event. It begins to become a lens through which we interpret reality. And few forces possess such destructive potential for our emotional and spiritual growth as this one. We often imagine that hatred is just a passing emotion. Something that emerges in a moment of anger, takes hold of us for a few minutes, and then fades away. But reality is far more complex. Hatred is not merely an emotional state. It is a condition that changes the way we think, the way we feel, and even the way our bodies function. Science has shown that intense emotions leave measurable traces in both the brain and the body. Researchers at University College London identified what has become known as the hate circuit, a network of brain regions that becomes especially active when a person is exposed to someone they deeply despise. One of the most fascinating aspects of this discovery is that some of these regions are associated with physical action, motor planning, and mechanisms related to confrontation. In other words, the brain does not treat hatred as a simple negative opinion. It responds as if it were facing a genuine threat, preparing for a battle that, in many cases, will never actually take place. The problem is that the body pays a heavy price for remaining in that state. Whenever we nurture thoughts of hostility, resentment, or revenge, the body releases stress-related chemicals such as cortisol and adrenaline. These substances are incredibly useful during moments of real danger. They helped our ancestors escape predators and survive in hostile environments. But when this system remains activated for weeks, months, or even years, what was designed to protect us begins to wear us down. Blood pressure rises. Sleep quality declines. Inflammatory processes increase. The immune system becomes less effective. Studies published in the journal Neurology have shown that intense episodes of anger can dramatically increase the risk of cardiovascular events in the hours that follow. It is as though every moment of hatred quietly demands a small payment from our vitality. A payment so small that it often goes unnoticed at first, yet significant when accumulated over the course of a lifetime. There is also a psychological phenomenon that can be especially destructive: mental rumination. Most people believe they suffer only when the painful event occurs. But very often, the real suffering begins afterward. The event ends. The argument is over. The betrayal belongs to the past. The humiliation happened years ago. Yet the mind continues returning to the same place. The scene is replayed again and again. Conversations are repeated internally. New responses are imagined. Judgments are reconstructed. Fantasies of revenge are created. And with every repetition, the emotional wound is partially reopened. For the brain, there is not always a clear distinction between vividly remembering an experience and reliving it. That is why a person can continue suffering from events that no longer exist anywhere except within memory itself. The past stops being a memory and gradually becomes a psychological environment in which the person lives every day. From a spiritual perspective, hatred produces one of the most subtle and dangerous transformations of human consciousness. It creates an illusion of moral superiority. Little by little, we stop seeing the other person as a complex human being, filled with contradictions, weaknesses, fears, and struggles. Instead, we begin to see them only through the lens of what they did to us. The person ceases to be a soul and becomes a symbol of our pain. In that process, the ego expands. Not a healthy form of growth rooted in wisdom or self-awareness, but a distorted expansion fueled by the need to be right, to condemn, to judge, and to keep the story of the offense alive. The more hatred grows, the more space it occupies within us. And the more space it occupies, the less room remains for serenity, compassion, wisdom, and inner peace. Perhaps the greatest paradox is this: we believe that hatred keeps us separated from those who hurt us, when in reality it keeps us bound to them through invisible chains. We think about them without realizing it. We react to them in our minds. We carry on imaginary conversations. We build hypothetical scenarios. A portion of our emotional energy continues to orbit around someone who may have already moved on with their life. It is a prison without bars, without walls, and without locks. A prison built entirely within the mind. And the longer we remain inside it, the more difficult it becomes to remember that the door was never truly closed. Humanity's spiritual traditions have long treated hatred as something far more dangerous than a simple negative emotion. They describe it as a force capable of distorting consciousness, clouding perception, and separating human beings from their highest nature. Within the Christian tradition, we find some of the deepest and most unsettling portraits of this process. The first great human drama described in Scripture is not a war between nations, nor a struggle over land, power, or wealth. It is a conflict born within the heart of a single man. The story of Cain and Abel is, in many ways, the story of how hatred enters the human soul. What is important to notice is that Abel never harmed Cain. He did not attack him. He did not humiliate him. He did not take anything from him. The conflict was not born from direct aggression. Cain's suffering emerged from comparison. He looked at his brother, and instead of seeing inspiration, he saw a threat. Instead of allowing another person's light to encourage his own growth, he experienced that light as a silent reminder of his own shortcomings. This remains one of the most common origins of hatred. Very often, we do not hate because we have been wounded. We hate because someone's existence awakens feelings within us that we would rather avoid. Another person's happiness may remind us of our sadness. Another person's success may expose our disappointments. Another person's courage may reveal our fears. And when we lack the maturity to face those emotions honestly, we risk transforming admiration, which could have elevated us, into resentment that slowly destroys us. Even before the murder takes place, the biblical narrative presents something profoundly symbolic. God warns Cain that evil is crouching at his door and that he must master it. This image has endured for thousands of years because it still describes the human experience. Hatred rarely enters violently. It knocks at the door disguised as comparison, envy, wounded pride, or a sense of injustice. At first, it appears small. It seems reasonable. It may even feel justified. But once we allow it to stay, it begins to grow. And when Cain finally kills Abel, something important becomes clear. The physical act of violence is not the true beginning of the tragedy. It is merely the visible consequence of an inner process that had been unfolding for a long time. The murder first occurred within consciousness. The final act simply gave form to something that had already been nurtured in silence. Perhaps that is why Cain's punishment is so symbolic. He becomes a wanderer, a restless fugitive, a man unable to find lasting peace. And this image perfectly captures the inner condition of those who carry hatred for too long. They continue living, working, speaking, and smiling. Yet deep within, there is a permanent unrest. A part of their soul remains trapped, endlessly circling a wound that never fully healed. Centuries later, we encounter another powerful example in the story of King Saul. Unlike Cain, Saul was not an ordinary man. He possessed power, wealth, influence, authority, and recognition. He was the king of Israel. He had achieved everything that most people believe is necessary for happiness and fulfillment. Yet hidden within his story is a profound lesson. No external success can protect a mind that has not learned how to deal with resentment. Everything begins when Saul hears the people celebrating David's victories. Scripture tells us that from that moment forward, he looked upon David with suspicion and hostility. At first glance, this may seem like a small detail. In reality, it contains remarkable wisdom. Before the pursuit, before the attempts on David's life, before open conflict, a change occurred in Saul's perception. And that is often how hatred begins. First, the way we see someone changes. Then our thoughts begin to change. Soon afterward, our interpretations change as well. We start assigning negative motives. We become suspicious of harmless actions. What was once neutral begins to appear threatening. The other person has not changed. We have. From that point forward, Saul makes David the center of his existence. He chases him through deserts, mountains, and caves. He organizes searches to find him. He spends enormous amounts of physical, emotional, and spiritual energy trying to destroy someone who is not even sitting on the throne. The tragedy of Saul's story is that he did not lose only David. He lost himself. He lost his peace. He lost his clarity of judgment. He damaged relationships. He lost the ability to appreciate the blessings he already possessed. His kingdom still existed, but his mind had become imprisoned by obsession. Hatred has this power. It hijacks attention. It steals presence. It causes an entire life to revolve around a single wound. This is why the teachings of Jesus move to an even deeper level. While most people focus on outward actions, Jesus directs attention to their invisible source. In the Sermon on the Mount, he teaches that the problem does not begin when violence appears in the world. It begins much earlier, when violence is allowed to take root within the heart. The wisdom of this teaching is extraordinary because it recognizes something that modern psychology has also observed. Almost no act of destruction emerges out of nowhere. Every action has a root. Every behavior begins as a seed. And hatred is one of the most dangerous seeds a person can cultivate. Not everyone who harbors hatred will commit an act of physical violence. But every act of violence is nourished in some way by emotions that were allowed to grow unchecked. When we view another person solely through the lens of resentment, we stop seeing their humanity. They cease to be a complex human being, filled with struggles, fears, weaknesses, and contradictions. They become an enemy, a symbol, a target. And perhaps this is the deepest spiritual damage caused by hatred. It does not merely destroy our image of another person. It destroys our ability to truly see. Because every time the heart closes itself completely to the humanity of another, a part of our own humanity closes with it. Human history is filled with examples of people who lost everything because they failed to master their own hatred. Some of these stories make headlines. Others unfold quietly, far from cameras and public attention. Yet they all reveal the same truth. When hatred takes control, it almost always demands a price far greater than we ever intended to pay. We only need to look at the tragedies that emerge from seemingly insignificant conflicts. A traffic dispute, an insult, a shove, a glance interpreted as a provocation. Within seconds, ordinary people, hardworking men and women, parents, individuals who never imagined themselves capable of extreme actions, make decisions that permanently alter the course of multiple lives. A single moment of lost control can transform an ordinary morning into an irreversible tragedy. One life is lost. Another becomes consumed by legal consequences, guilt, regret, and suffering. And when the dust finally settles, nearly everyone involved is left asking the same question: how did something so small end this way? The answer is that these tragedies rarely begin in that specific moment. They are usually the result of emotions that have been accumulating for a long time. The final incident is merely the spark that lands on ground that was already dry. Yet perhaps the most common forms of destruction never appear in the news at all. There are people who spend years carrying resentment toward former friends, family members, ex-partners, or co-workers. On the surface, they seem to be living normal lives. They work. They pay bills. They smile in photographs. They attend family gatherings. But a significant portion of their emotional energy remains trapped in events that belong to the past. Without realizing it, they allow a single wound to become the gravitational center of their lives. Every conversation eventually returns to the same subject. Every memory reconnects to the same pain. Every achievement is overshadowed by an injustice that was never fully released. The past ceases to be a memory and gradually becomes a permanent residence for the mind. In more extreme cases, some people spend years, or even decades, planning revenge. They build their identity around the idea of settling scores. They imagine the day when they will finally see the other person suffer. They fantasize about the moment when justice will at last be served. Yet there is something profoundly tragic about this path. When revenge finally arrives, if it arrives at all, the peace that was promised almost never comes with it. Because revenge may satisfy an impulse for a moment, but it has no power to heal an inner wound. The person eventually discovers that they devoted a precious portion of their life to a pursuit that could never provide what they were truly seeking. And perhaps that is precisely why hatred is so dangerous. It convinces us that we are fighting for justice when, in reality, we are often strengthening an invisible prison. Neuroscience offers an interesting explanation for this phenomenon. During intense states of anger and hostility, the brain's more primitive systems begin to take command. The networks associated with survival, confrontation, and immediate reaction become increasingly active, while the regions responsible for planning, reflection, and evaluating consequences lose influence. In simple terms, the greater the hatred, the more difficult it becomes to see the bigger picture. This is why so many decisions made in the grip of anger seem irrational when viewed later. What felt absolutely necessary in the moment becomes difficult to understand only a few hours afterward. What felt like a battle worth fighting reveals itself to have been an unnecessary loss. What appeared to be justice reveals itself as destruction. When hatred takes hold of the steering wheel, awareness stops looking toward the horizon and becomes fixated on the obstacle directly ahead. And perhaps this is one of the most dangerous qualities of hatred. It reduces an entire universe of possibilities to a single wound, causing us to forget everything else that is still worth protecting. Because in the end, hatred rarely destroys only the person toward whom it is directed. More often than not, it destroys first the person who carries it. For most of human history, hatred encountered natural limits. Not because people were more virtuous, but because daily life imposed certain boundaries. It was difficult to turn someone into a permanent enemy when you had to see them in the town square, work alongside them, live in the same community, or look into their eyes while speaking. The digital age has fundamentally changed that reality. For the first time in history, billions of people interact every day without many of the elements that naturally encourage empathy. We do not hear tone of voice. We do not see facial expressions. We cannot perceive hesitation, sadness, or vulnerability. We interact with words, images, profiles, and opinions. Gradually, complex human beings are reduced to avatars, usernames, and ideological positions. And when we stop seeing someone's humanity, it becomes much easier to treat them as an abstraction. Perhaps this is one of the defining phenomena of our time. Never before have we possessed so many tools for communication, and yet it has never been easier to forget that we are communicating with real people. Digital platforms did not need to invent hatred. They simply discovered that intense emotions hold attention longer. Shock captures the eye. Outrage interrupts reflection. Controversy sparks curiosity. And few emotions can keep a person glued to a screen as effectively as the feeling of being morally outraged. As a result, much of the digital environment functions like a machine designed to accelerate emotions. What might have remained a simple disagreement becomes a conflict. Conflict becomes hostility. Hostility evolves into contempt. And contempt, repeated day after day, begins to shape the way we view entire groups of people. The problem is not only the content we consume. It is also the pace at which we consume it. For thousands of years, human beings had time to process emotions, reflect on events, and allow intense feelings to settle naturally. Today, before one wave of outrage has faded, another has already taken its place. Before one controversy disappears, a new one is competing for our attention. Many people live in a nearly constant state of irritation without ever realizing it. The result is a mind that is continuously stimulated, continuously reacting, and rarely contemplating. And there is a profound difference between reacting and understanding. Reaction is immediate. Understanding requires time. Reaction looks for someone to blame. Understanding looks for causes. Reaction divides the world into allies and enemies. Understanding recognizes the complexity of the human experience. Perhaps that is why cancel culture has become so appealing. It offers something the ego deeply enjoys. A sense of moral superiority without requiring compassion, dialogue, or genuine understanding. Judging is fast. Condemning is easy. Understanding takes effort. But whenever we find ourselves taking pleasure in another person's public humiliation, it may be worth asking an uncomfortable question. What exactly is being strengthened within us? Because every action repeated often enough leaves an imprint on consciousness. When we cultivate patience, we become more patient. When we cultivate generosity, we become more generous. And when we make constant outrage a habit, little by little, we become people who are constantly outraged. Perhaps the greatest danger is not what hatred does to society. The greatest danger is what it quietly does to perception itself. After all, whatever we contemplate day after day eventually shapes the person we become. And a mind that continuously feeds on hostility gradually begins to see hostility everywhere. It finds enemies where there were only differences. It finds threats where there were only disagreements. It finds reasons for outrage in situations that, at another point in life, would have passed unnoticed. In this way, hatred ceases to be an occasional emotion. It becomes a way of inhabiting the world. In light of all this, an unavoidable question emerges. Is there a way to prevent hatred from becoming a dominant force within us? The answer is not found in suppressing emotions or pretending that pain does not exist. Hatred does not disappear when it is denied. Emotions that are ignored often remain active beneath the surface of awareness, shaping thoughts and behaviors without our knowledge. Genuine transformation begins with a willingness to look honestly at what is happening within. Hatred often presents itself as a simple emotion, yet its roots are rarely simple. Beneath the surface, there are frequently frustrations, insecurities, disappointments, humiliations, fears, or wounds that never received the attention they required. The mind directs all of its energy toward an external target while the deeper cause remains hidden. As a result, many people spend years trying to defeat enemies without realizing that the most important battle is still taking place within themselves. The path of emotional and spiritual maturity requires a shift in perspective. Rather than focusing solely on who caused the pain, it becomes necessary to understand why a particular experience gains such power over the mind. This inquiry does not excuse injustice, nor does it transform wrongdoing into virtue. What it offers is something that hatred often steals: the ability to understand ourselves more deeply. Another essential aspect involves our relationship with impulse. A great deal of human suffering arises from the remarkably short distance between feeling and acting. An emotion appears and immediately becomes words. A thought arises and immediately becomes behavior. A provocation occurs and immediately produces a reaction. In this accelerated process, awareness is given very little room to operate. This is one reason contemplative traditions have always placed such value on silence, observation, and patience. There is profound wisdom in the ability to remain present with an emotion without becoming governed by it. As this capacity develops, an important realization begins to emerge. Not everything we feel needs to become action. Not every moment of outrage requires a response. Not every offense demands confrontation. Not every wound deserves the authority to determine the direction of our lives. Over time, it becomes possible to recognize hatred before it takes control. It may still arise. It may still visit the mind. It may still attempt to justify its presence. The difference is that it no longer finds a permanent home in which to settle. Among all the spiritual teachings related to this subject, few are as challenging as the invitation to extend compassion toward those who awaken our most difficult emotions. This idea appears across different traditions and in different forms, yet it points toward the same principle. Inner liberation begins when we stop organizing our identity around the figure of an adversary. This does not mean approving destructive behavior, ignoring abuse, or abandoning discernment. It simply means refusing to hand over ownership of our inner world to another person. As long as someone continues to occupy our thoughts, our emotions, and our peace of mind, they maintain an influence that extends far beyond the original injury. True freedom emerges when consciousness stops orbiting around the offense and regains the ability to direct its energy toward what fosters growth, meaning, and fulfillment. In the end, overcoming hatred is not a gift offered to those who hurt us. It is an act of responsibility toward our own soul. Each time we choose not to nourish resentment, we reclaim a portion of the energy that had been trapped in the past. Each time we interrupt a cycle of hostility, we create space for higher forms of awareness. And each time we refuse to turn a wound into an identity, we take another step toward the person we are capable of becoming. Spiritual growth does not occur when we run out of reasons to hate. It occurs when those reasons no longer determine who we are. In the end, hatred represents a quiet choice that we make every day. Not the choice between agreement and disagreement. Not the choice between remembering and forgetting. Not even the choice between justice and injustice. The deeper choice lies in deciding how much space we are willing to allow a wound to occupy within our consciousness. There are pains worth remembering so that wisdom may emerge from them. There are experiences that call for boundaries, discernment, and clarity. Yet none of these require us to carry resentment indefinitely. Hatred promises strength, but leaves exhaustion behind. It promises protection, but creates captivity. It promises justice, yet often delivers only more suffering. With time, a simple truth becomes increasingly clear. The person who is truly free is not the one who has defeated every adversary. It is the one who no longer organizes life around them. There is a rare kind of serenity that comes with reaching this understanding. A serenity that is not born from the absence of hardship, but from the ability to move through hardship without allowing it to define who we are. When the mind stops feeding old conflicts, an extraordinary amount of energy becomes available for what truly matters: growth, service, learning, love, creation, contemplation, and a life lived with presence. Inner peace does not arrive when the world finally behaves according to our expectations. It emerges when we stop surrendering our inner state to external circumstances. Perhaps this is one of the highest expressions of spiritual maturity, preserving one's inner light while passing through darkness. Before we close, take a few moments of stillness and join in a prayer that has guided countless generations. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. May peace accompany your thoughts, your words, and your choices in the days ahead. If this reflection resonated with your own journey, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. The insights, experiences, and perspectives we exchange often become part of one another's growth. Thank you for spending this time here. May you move forward with greater lightness, deeper clarity, and a more peaceful heart. Until next time.